Judge said to introduce him. There's a whole page here, but didn't want to. Anyway, thank you, sir.
No. Well, good afternoon, everybody. The reason I wanted to do the introduction like that, most of you know who I am, but you don't really know who I am. After the election of 2018, Rice University called and asked if I wanted to come back over there, and I said absolutely. They did not check my undergraduate transcript. That's the good news. Things might have turned out differently had they done that. But it didn't take me but a little over a year to convince them that I really was somebody before I was county judge, and that I didn't want to be the politician in exile. And for those of you, I know, back there, those of you who have ever dealt with an academic institution, you think politics is strange? You ought to deal with an academic institution. So it's right behind churches, I guess, in terms of the way things work. But anyway, I had to go back and produce all the papers that I presented around the world in 28 countries, talking about transportation, talking about my background as Interstate Commerce Commissioner. And then the light came on and they went, oh, well, rather than you being at the Kinder Institute, maybe you should be at the Baker Institute for Public Policy and become our Energy and Transportation Fellow. So here I am. But the energy's misleading. I don't know anything about energy policy. I was chairman of the Texas House Committee on Energy in 1985, which qualifies me for absolutely nothing. But they didn't have a Center for Transportation, so they have a Center for Energy Studies. And so technically I'm the transportation guy in the Center for Energy Studies. So it's in that role that I'm going around and speaking, and I was really glad to be here, be able to come here today for a lot of reasons. And by the way, in case you don't know, I am also a radio celebrity. I don't think any of you have heard me on radio, have you? Well, if you'll listen to channel 146 on Sirius XM, it is Road Dog Trucking. And I'm a regular guest on Road Dog Trucking. And that's where you find out literally what's going on in the transportation world, because all the drivers call in, want to talk to you about this or that. And that's been a lot of fun. So I'm doing that on the side in addition to my Baker role. Today's going to be more of a conversation. It's not going to be a class lecture or anything like that. It's going to be a conversation about transportation, but I have a certain bias toward freight transportation, so you have to go along with that. Now, I'm going to start by reading a little bit of history, because what you're doing really isn't new. It's important, don't get me wrong, but groups have been trying to do this for a long, long time. The Old Spanish Trail. I don't know how many of you know anything about the Old Spanish Trail or how it got created, but conceived in 1915 as the shortest route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the Old Spanish Trail connected St. Augustine, Florida and San Diego, California. That was the idea. Shortest distance between the two oceans. It took nearly 15 years to construct at a cost of $80,000 from St. Augustine, Florida to San Diego. Now, where was it started? Well, you might say San Diego or St. Augustine. No, it was organized at Mobile, Alabama in 1915. And so it got its start in a city that really didn't have any connection to Spanish history at all. But since Alabama had done so little to promote Mobile's growth and transportation, people locally took it upon themselves to go out and start organizing. So the need for an east-west, I'm skipping around here because there's a fun point I'm going to get to here in just a minute. The local Chamber of Commerce, members of the Rotary Club, they devised a scheme to try and get a highway that would come through Mobile Therefore, Mobile could grow and they could bring in supporters from both ends, San Diego and St. Augustine. So they announced their intention in October of 1950. They decided to name it the Old Spanish Trail. It was envisioned as affording tourists the ability to see Florida towns come through Mobile and go west along the Mississippi coast, through New Orleans, all the way to California. Got its official launch at a rousing convention, populated by good roads boosters and Chamber of Commerce officials, ambitious local and state politicians, got a few of those here, newspaper men, and the curious. And each appointed a so-called delegate of the Old Spanish Trail Association. The association hired 2 newspaper men to publicize the convention and dispatched messengers to drum up support for the highway. Now comes the really good part. A scout car driven by James A. Emmett, that would be my grandfather, went ahead of the delegation to test the enthusiasm and earnestness existing along the suggested routes between Jacksonville and Mobile. The car was warmly received throughout Florida, turning out record crowds of good roads enthusiasts. One county, now I'm not asking for anything here, but I'm just telling you, one county even promised to name the road Emmett Lane if the Old Spanish Trail Association selected their route. So, why do I tell you all that? Well, because you're kind of a continuum of history. And it wasn't until a few years ago I realized I was kind of a continuum of history too. My dear old granddad, and by the way, just to complete the story a little bit, it has nothing to do with the road, but a year later, he turned up dead in a town in Alabama and nobody knows why. So I hope that wasn't a harbinger of things to come. But anyway, so what you're doing, 36A may not sound quite as romantic as Old Spanish Trail. It's probably a little late for you to change the name of this process. But your purpose is no doubt more important than simply bringing tourists to the area. Your purpose has to do with economy, has to do with safety. And the safety I'm just going to gloss over. Yeah, we're talking about hurricane season and the fact that it's another evacuation route, and that's so patently obvious, we don't need to spend any time talking about that. And anytime you can do something that reduces congestion on roads, then that adds to safety. So I'm going to focus mainly on the factors for the economy, and some of them you heard about already this morning. Let's start with Port Freeport. It's certain to grow. I mean, that's not, you don't have to be an economist, you don't have to be a supply chain expert. All you have to do is look at the location. It's on the Gulf Coast. It's perfectly situated, and I've said this for years. Our area is the gateway of North America. And Port Houston's gonna grow and handle as much as it can, but Port Houston has got an issue that Freeport doesn't have. It's called a 52-mile dredge versus, what is it, a 6-mile dredge. So Freeport is going to grow. And we can talk about railroads and this, that, and the other. But that shorter dredge and the location on the coast is gonna certainly make Freeport grow. And with that growth is gonna come what? Containers. And containers, not only deep water, but also barge. And you know, Freeport right now is, I don't think I'm telling a secret here, trying to become part of what's called the Marine Highway. Because if you look at the United States and compare it to the way traffic moves in Europe, we move, even though we have a lot of barge traffic, we don't move near as much coastwise as they do in Europe. Some people say it's because of the Jones Act. I don't want to get off into a long discussion of that. But the bottom line is, that's an area of growth, and Freeport sits right there on the Intercoastal Waterway. It's perfectly situated for it. So that's going to happen. So you got Port Freeport. Beyond that, if you drive out I-10, which all of us do on a regular basis, all those distribution centers, amazing. Why are they there? Frankly, I'm not sure. I mean, if you think about it, the containers that come into the port have to then transit all the way through the congested part of Houston and Harris County to get there. But supply chain experts, for whatever reason, decided to move those distribution centers west. Maybe it's because they can serve the state of Texas better from out there. Even trains that come from LA Long Beach to Houston come into, Setagast or one of the other yards, and then are put on trucks, the containers, and trucked back out west. That doesn't make any sense. So the fact that those distribution centers are moving to the west, where's the perfect place to feed them from? The south. What's the north-south highway? Well, could be 36A. And even if it doesn't go straight to them, anything that gets you a shorter distance without having to go through Houston is going to be a good thing. So that's going to help drive what you're doing. The other one that almost nobody talks about. Have you been to Laredo lately? I mean, there was some conversation about El Paso, but Laredo, the number is staggering. It's roughly 14,000 trucks a day that go across the border there. Laredo, in terms of cargo value, is now the third largest in the United States. Third largest port. You don't think about it, but it's high value cargo that's coming in. You say, well, Laredo's a long way from us. Right now, I-69 is not complete, pretty much from Laredo to Goliad. It's still a 2-lane road with some passing lanes. But Texas has a freight advisory committee that I've chaired for about the last 10 years. And one of the priorities, again, I'm not telling secrets, it's ultimately up to the Texas Transportation Commission, but completion of I-69 is going to be a state priority, no question. So the traffic that currently is going up I-35 and east on 10 is going to be going straight up Interstate 69. Well, if I read things correctly, 36A is going to be a pretty good feeder and access. So think about, back to those distribution centers, don't need to just talk about ports. Think about the truck traffic that's going to be coming to feed those distribution centers. There's also being built in Victoria. Full disclosure, I'm a consultant to the Port of Victoria. They have announced a Texas Logistics Center. They have about 2,000 acres. Most people say Port Victoria, that's inland, well, it's on the barge canal. But it's also at I-69, and it's served by both the BNSF and the Union Pacific Railroad. And Kansas City Southern serves Victoria, though not the port. So that whole area is going to be very ripe for logistics center. And you say, well, that's a little bit inland. So there was a conversation, I think it was with regard to the freight shuttle. Somebody mentioned Savannah. If you've not been to Savannah, Georgia, go. You'll see the future. The Port of Savannah has grown, it's taken on a leadership position on the East Coast. But Savannah's this nice little historic town, and the truck traffic was just getting out of hand. So the Georgia Port Authority worked with the railroads to build 2 inland terminals, one for the Norfolk Southern, one for the CSX. And what's going to happen is they're going to move by rail most of the boxes to one of those 2 terminals, and then the trucks will pick them up there. Happens to be about the same distance that Victoria is from Freeport and Houston. So I think you're going to begin to see more and more things like that occur. All of it tied around I-69. So since I've mentioned the railroads, got Union Pacific, you've got BNSF. But something else is about to go on. Kansas City Southern is very likely to be acquired by the Canadian Pacific. Why is that important? What was the Kansas City Southern built for initially? And who did it?
Was it an access to Mexico?
It was access to Mexico. And the port is Lázaro Cárdenas. And if that's not pronounced right, I apologize. But it's on the West Coast. And the founder of Kansas City Southern wanted a route from the Pacific to the Midwest. And what's lost on most people is Lázaro is 500 miles closer to Chicago than LA Long Beach is. But it's never really been developed. But if Canadian Pacific, with fairly deep pockets, acquires the Kansas City Southern, then not only are you going to see rail traffic, by the way, KCS already owns the bridge, the rail bridge at Laredo. You're going to start seeing rail traffic come through, and it'll make the operation at Kendleton look like, Tinker Toys. And if I look at the map right, what has good access to that rail line? 36A. So I'm trying to get everybody thinking, and I'm going to confess, I wasn't a big fan of 36A, right? When it started, I was skeptical. But the more things that come together, the more I'm not only a fan, I don't think y'all are thinking big enough. I think you need to start talking to the people in Laredo and talk, just like the people in Mobile talk to folks in San Diego and St. Augustine, Florida. You got other partners in this that you don't even know about, and they certainly don't know about it yet. And so if you can get them engaged, then that's going to help tremendously. So the bottom line is, this is the good news, I'll get to the bad news in a minute. The bottom line is, this is a dynamic area that really needs improvements. And whether the alignment and the details of 36A are exactly what is needed, it's not for me to say. You've got a room full of experts, and certainly you can call on consultants. But the concept is great. And the concept has to start moving quicker. But there are challenges, lots of challenges. First and foremost, funding and the competition for that funding. And that doesn't just apply to this project. I mean, the state, the federal government relies on the gasoline tax. Well, you got the federal government saying we're going to go all electric. It's not going to happen, but it is going to change the impact. The legislature is going to have to come up with some new way of funding transportation other than the gas tax and the diesel tax. So those highway funding issues, they've got to be solved. So that's going to hurt. The good news is, Texas Department of Transportation, and I've worked with DOTs all over the country, it's the best. It's a wonderful organization to work for. Yeah, the politics get in the way sometimes, of course, but that comes with the territory. But it's a matter of setting priorities. And so I think TxDOT and the elected officials have got to decide, okay, what are our priorities? Now, there are some elected officials that have different priorities. I'll talk about that in a minute. Because politics is going to get involved. How? Well, I've been giving an entire speech on the woke world of transportation. If you've heard Secretary Buttigieg, he has a different narrative about transportation. I won't say that he had absolutely no experience or qualifications to be Secretary of Transportation, but there was no background. So he comes in with a different view. That's not always bad. But if you listen to what's being said, the narrative goes like this. highways made life worse. Suburban sprawl is bad, the environment was damaged, and they're going back and rewriting history. And I'm gonna quote El Franco Lee here in a minute. Talk about a county commissioner that I miss on a regular basis. Commissioner Lee, even if you didn't agree with him, he was solid. He was somebody who knew what needed to be done and how to get it done. And anyway, but there was a headline recently. It said, infrastructure bill could address past harm to black low-income neighborhoods caused by the interstate system. And that's a conversation that people don't like to have. You know, you flinch anytime you start talking about race and highways. But the reality is, back in the 1950s, rightly or wrongly, there were some people who said, well, we need to remove urban blight. And so they saw neighborhoods that didn't look good as being blight. Probably wrong, but you can't go back and say, gosh, their intent was to do something horrible. But where it really gets extreme, and this is where I'm going to bring Franco back into the conversation, because I was with him, and Kevin, you may have heard him say this too. He spent his whole life in the Fifth Ward. And so when a gentleman wrote a book basically saying the East Texas Freeway destroyed the Fifth Ward, Franco called BS on that. Because yes, it cut off a piece of the Fifth Ward, but the timing was such, and this is where the conversation, you have to stick with me here. The timing was such, it occurred at almost the same time as what? Desegregation. And so for the first time, people who could move out of an area did. And when they moved out, then what was left behind was a lesser economically vital area. Now, was that the intent of the highway builders or not? Doesn't matter. Problem is that narrative is out there. So we're gonna have to talk about that. And it's not enough to say, and that's the project I'm working on at the Baker Institute, we're literally going back and going parcel by parcel and determining who was displaced by which highway and what were the demographics of it. And that way we can be dealing in fact. And there is a movement afoot, not a bad one, to put neighborhoods back together that were disrupted. But some of those neighborhoods don't exist anymore. So how does that apply to you? Well, even though you think you're out here away from the urban area, I can guarantee you these conversations are going to come up. So it's not enough to say, well, that's just not right. No, it may be right, it may be wrong, but you got to address it. And, you know, look at the institution we're sitting in. By the way, I'm one of the biggest fans of Prairie View and have been for a long, long time. I think it has been an underutilized resource for the state of Texas. And it seems to be now that people are putting resources here, and that's a good thing. But when you start talking about building a new highway, going through neighborhoods, whether you're talking about old cemeteries or whatever, there's got to be this consciousness now that you can't just assume everybody's going to think a highway is a good thing. Now, we've had a local politician use a phrase that we need to be building highways for people, not cars. I have no idea what the hell that means. I know she meant well, but the last time I checked, every car had a person in it. We're not to the driverless cars completely yet. And while you can look at highways, they may not be beneficial for one area, but if you look at the whole length of the highway, they do a whole lot. And so 36A is going to be that too. You have to take it in toto, you can't have, I remember when I moved to Houston in 1966, Loop 610 wasn't built. They had cleared the right of way through Bel Air. There was one house sitting right out in the middle. That guy held out for like 2 years. and the frontage roads were on either side, and cars were going by, and he had to cross the frontage roads to get to his driveway. Was he wrong? No, but you couldn't let him stop the entire progress. So we need to take this narrative and be serious about it, and not just poo-poo it and mock it. So the three considerations that are gonna have to be taken into account. The urban core versus suburbs. Now that's really code for what? Mass transit versus highway. Any way you look at it. You have people that think you shouldn't be spending money on highways because that takes money away from mass transit. Gotta have the debate. So if you're gonna build 36A, that's money that could have been spent somewhere else. You're gonna have people that, may say, well, wouldn't that money be better spent, doing more bike paths or something? You'll have that argument. We've seen it at HGAC on a regular basis. You're gonna have to talk about social equity. How does it benefit everybody? It's not enough anymore to say, well, 36A is gonna be this wonderful boon to the businesses in this area. No, you gotta be more clear than that. And that's not a bad thing. You gotta talk about the whole social equity. And I know you've been dealing with this already, the whole environmental justice question. Katy Prairie has certainly been a big part of the conversation out here. But it won't just be that. It will be, I'm gonna tiptoe off into something dangerous here. Think about the high-speed rail. When they started talking about that. People whose land it was crossing weren't very happy about it. And I told people over and over and over, I am a fan of high-speed rail. But if somebody said they were gonna come take my cabin in Upper Liberty County for, I don't care, a pipeline or highway or a rail line, I'd be mad, but it wouldn't make me right. And so you're gonna have to figure out how to deal with that. And some of that, I'm not picking on your boss, but some of that's driven by rich folks who are from Houston and go out and buy lots of land out in the country and don't want that country land to be converted into not just highway, but the economic activities that go along with the highway. So you're gonna have to consider that. The final thing I'd like to say is we're also in a whole different world. When you started thinking about 36A, it was a highway. Well, there was a conversation about a rail line too. But now you have a whole new technology. What if, kind of giving an assignment here, that's what I get to do now since I teach. What if in addition to bringing in allies from Laredo and Victoria and all over, you also decide, why don't we make 36A the corridor for the future? Why don't we go ahead and put every new technology that we might need in that? For example, TxDOT has already announced a lot of EV charging stations. More and more trucks, the short haul trucks, are gonna go electric. Eventually they'll go hydrogen, I think. So the energy experts around me at Baker Institute say. Why not go ahead and start building that component in to what you're doing here? It's a perfect test bed, just like the freight shuttle. Where's my freight shuttle guy? Is he still here? Did he leave? How long ago did that first come up in conversation? 20 years, 15 years at least. And that's actually, maybe coming to fruition. Well, there may be a component that ties into that. That if you're talking about Freeport up to the rail line, for example. It's a long haul, but it might. But so my sort of final statement, and I'll be happy to, I was told I was going to be run off right at 1 o'clock, so I'll be sure to leave just enough time for a question or two, and if they're not fun questions, I can stall. My final thing is, you started something that was a good idea, but now you need to figure out how to make it just a great idea that starts getting attention outside of this area. Don't look at 36A as just a little regional improvement. Look at 36A as the road for the future and something that has national and international impact. Get the Canadian Pacific Railroad interested in what you're doing. Reach out, get new technologies interested in what you're doing. If, for example, you can design it so that it's better for driverless trucks. By the way, I'm not a fan of driverless trucks, but the legislature has authorized their use on Texas highways. You've got a brand new facility, why not make it such that it's the test bed for how well those things can work? It's a good idea. So, I applaud what you're doing. Hopefully I expanded your view a little bit today, and with that I'll stop and take any questions you might have about anything except politics. Yes, sir.
So, TxDOT has drainage plans for different plans for its highways, typical drainage plans for its highways. I-45 got kind of clogged up because the drainage works for the highway, but it doesn't work for the rest of the community. Can you tell us how 36A can adapt to that? Because I noticed there's a big river along 36A.
Well, I'm not sure I accept your premise that I-45 doesn't work for the community. In fact, it improves the White Oak Bio situation a great deal over what's there now. And now we're talking about raising the part of I-10 that goes over, and that too improves the process. So, yeah, I think TxDOT's fully aware of the things that have caused problems in the past, and they're trying to address those. So 36A would be part of that. Yes, sir.
On your statement about corridor of the future, for the 36A project, we are developing an alternative that is the future of transportation, which will be a layover to your traditional alternatives. And we entertain, and we'd like to talk to folks about what is the future. And hopefully we develop an adaptable road that will adapt to future technologies. So that's going to be part of our study. We do exactly what you said.
Okay, good. One more? Yes? No? Well, keep on doing what you're doing. I appreciate your work, and anything I can do to help, if you're interested, let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, we appreciate it. This is a token of our appreciation being here today.